Andrei Romanovich Chikatilo was a Ukrainian-born Soviet serial killer nicknamed the Butcher of Rostov, the Red Ripper, or the Rostov Ripper, who committed the murders of a minimum of 52 women and children between 1978 and 1990. He was convicted of 52 murders in October 1992, although he did confess to a total of 56 murders and was tried for 53 of these killings, and was subsequently executed for the murders for which he was convicted. In February 1994, Chikatilo was known by such titles as the Rostov Ripper and the Butcher of Rostov because the majority of his murders were committed in the Rostov Oblast of the Russian SFSR. Biography: Early life. Andrei Chikatilo was born in the village of Yablochne, in modern Sumy Oblast of the Ukrainian SSR. He was born soon after the famine in Ukraine caused by Joseph Stalin's forced collectivization of agriculture. Ukrainian farmers were forced to hand in their entire crop for statewide distribution. Mass starvation ran rampant throughout Ukraine, and reports of cannibalism soared. Chikatilo's mother, Anna, told him that his older brother, Stepan, had been kidnapped and cannibalized by starving neighbors, although it has never been independently established whether this actually happened. Chikatilo's parents were both farm laborers who lived in a one-room hut. As a child, Chikatilo slept on a single bed with his parents. He was a chronic bedwetter and was berated and beaten by his mother for each offense. When the Soviet Union entered World War II, his father, Roman, was drafted into the Red Army and subsequently taken prisoner after being wounded in combat. During the war, Chikatilo witnessed some of the effects of Blitzkrieg, which both frightened and excited him. On one occasion, Chikatilo and his mother were forced to watch their hut burn to the ground. In 1943, while Chikatilo's father was at the front, Chikatilo's mother gave birth to a baby girl. In 1949, Chikatilo's father, who had been liberated by the Americans, returned home. Instead of being rewarded for his war service, he was branded a traitor for surrendering to the Germans. Shy and studious as a child, Chikatilo was an avid reader of communist literature. He was also a target for bullying by his peers. During adolescence, he discovered that he suffered from chronic impotence, worsening his social awkwardness and self-hatred. Chikatilo was shy in the company of females. His only sexual experience as a teenager was when he, aged 17, jumped on an 11-year-old friend of his younger sister and wrestled her to the ground, ejaculating as the girl struggled in his grasp. In 1953, Chikatilo finished school and applied for a scholarship at the Moscow State University. Although he passed the entrance examination, his grades were not good enough for acceptance. Between 1957 and 1960, Chikatilo performed his compulsory military service. Marriage and teaching career. In 1963, Chikatilo married a woman to whom he was introduced by his younger sister. The couple had a son and daughter. Chikatilo later claimed that his marital sex life was minimal and that, after his wife understood that he was unable to maintain an erection, he and his wife agreed that in order that she could conceive, he would ejaculate externally and push his semen inside her vagina with his fingers. In 1965, their daughter Ludmila was born, followed by son Yuri in 1969. In 1971, Chikatilo completed a correspondence course in Russian literature and obtained his degree in the subject from Rostov University. Chikatilo began his career as a teacher of Russian language and literature in Novoshakhtinsk. His career as a teacher ended in March 1981 after several complaints of child molestation against pupils of both sexes. Chikatilo eventually took a job as a supply clerk for a factory. Beginning the murders. In September 1978, Chikatilo moved to Shakhty, a small coal mining town near Rostov-on-Don, where he committed his first documented murder. On the 22nd of December, he lured a 9-year-old girl named Yelena Zakatnova to an old house which he had secretly purchased. He attempted to rape her, but failed to achieve an erection. When the girl struggled, he choked her to death and stabbed her body, ejaculating in the process of knifing the child. Chikatilo then dumped Zakatnova's body in a nearby river. Despite evidence linking Chikatilo to the girl's death, spots of the girl's blood were found in the snow near Chikatilo's house, and a witness had given police a detailed description of a man closely resembling Chikatilo, who she had seen talking with Zakatnova at the bus stop where the girl was last seen alive, a 25-year-old named Alexandra Kravchenko who, as a teenager, had served a jail sentence for the rape and murder of a teenage girl, was arrested for the crime and subsequently confessed to the killing. He was tried for the murder in 1979. At his trial, Kravchenko retracted his confession and maintained his innocence, stating his confession had been obtained under extreme duress. Despite his retraction, he was convicted of the murder and sentenced to 15 years imprisonment, the maximum possible length of imprisonment at that time. Under pressure from the victim's relatives, Kravchenko was retried and eventually executed for the murder of Lena Zakatnova in July 1983. Following Zakatnova's murder, Chikatilo was only able to achieve sexual arousal and orgasm through stabbing and slashing women and children to death, and he later stated the urge to relive the experience overwhelmed him. Chikatilo committed his next murder in September 1981, when he tried to have sex with a 17-year-old boarding school student named Larisa Tkachenko in a forest near the Don River. When Chikatilo failed to achieve an erection, he became furious and battered and strangled her to death. As he had no knife, he mutilated her body with his teeth and a stick. Following Biryuk's murder, Chikatilo no longer attempted to resist his homicidal urges. Between July and December 1982, he killed a further 6 victims between the ages of 9 and 19. He established a pattern of approaching children, runaways and young vagrants at bus or railway stations, enticing them to a nearby forest or other secluded area and killing them, usually by stabbing, slashing and eviscerating the victim with a knife. Although some victims, in addition to receiving a multitude of knife wounds, were also strangled or battered to death. Many of the bodies found bore striations of the eye sockets. Pathologists concluded the injuries were caused by a knife, leading investigators to the conclusion the killer had gouged out the eyes of his victims. Chikatilo's adult female victims were often prostitutes or homeless women who could be lured to secluded areas with promises of alcohol or money. Chikatilo would typically attempt intercourse with these victims, but he would usually be unable to get an erection, which would send him into a murderous fury, particularly if the woman mocked his impotence. He would achieve orgasm only when he stabbed the victim to death. His child victims were of both sexes. Chikatilo would lure these victims to secluded areas using a variety of ruses, usually formed in the initial conversation with the victim, such as promising them assistance or company, with the offer to show the victim a shortcut, a chance to view rare stamps, films, or coins, or with an offer of food or candy. He would usually overpower these victims once they were alone, tie their hands behind their backs with a length of rope, and then proceed to kill them. Investigation. Chikatilo did not kill again until June 1983, but he had killed 5 more times before September. The accumulation of bodies and the similarities between the pattern of wounds inflicted on the victims forced the Soviet authorities to acknowledge a serial killer was on the loose. On the 6th of September 1983, the public prosecutor of the USSR formally linked 6 of the murders thus far committed to the same killer. A Moscow police team, headed by Major Mikhail Fedosov, was sent to Rostov-on-Don to direct the investigation. Fedosov centered the investigations around Shakhty and assigned a specialist forensic analyst, Viktor Burakov, to head the investigation. Due to the sheer savagery of the murders, much of the police effort concentrated on mentally ill citizens, homosexuals, known pedophiles and sex offenders, slowly working through all that were known and eliminating them from the inquiry. A number of young men confessed to the murders, although they were usually mentally handicapped youths who had admitted to the crimes only under prolonged and often brutal interrogation. 3 known homosexuals and a convicted sex offender committed suicide as a result of the investigators' heavy-handed tactics, but as police obtained confessions from suspects, bodies continued to be discovered, proving the suspects who had previously confessed could not be the killer the police were seeking. In October 1983, Chikatilo killed a 19-year-old prostitute, and in December, a 14-year-old schoolboy named Sergei Markov. The killings continue. In January and February 1984, Chikatilo killed 2 women in Rostov's Aviators Park. On the 24th of March, he lured a 10-year-old boy named Dmitry Pashnikov away from a stamp kiosk in Novoshakhtinsk. While walking with the boy, Chikatilo was seen by several witnesses who were able to give investigators a detailed description of the killer. When Tashnikov's body was found 3 days later, police also found a footprint of the killer and semen and saliva samples on the victim's clothing. On May 25, Chikatilo killed a young woman, Tatiana Petrosyan, and her 11-year-old daughter, Svetlana, in Woodland outside Shakhty. Petrosyan had known Chikatilo for several years prior to her murder. By the 19th of July, he had killed 3 further young women between the ages of 19 and 22 and a 13-year-old boy. In the summer of 1984, Chikatilo was fired from his work as a supply clerk for theft of property. The accusation had been filed against Chikatilo the previous February, and he had been asked to resign quietly, but had refused to do so as he had denied the charges. Chikatilo found another job as a supply clerk in Rostov on the 1st of August. On the 2nd of August, Chikatilo killed a 16-year-old girl, Natalia Golosovskaya, in Aviators Park, and on the 7th of August, he killed a 17-year-old girl on the banks of the Don River before flying to the Uzbekistan capital of Tashkent on a business trip. By the time Chikatilo returned to Rostov on the 15th of August, he had killed a young woman and a 12-year-old girl. Within 2 weeks, an 11-year-old boy had been found strangled, castrated, and with his eyes gouged out in Rostov before a young librarian, Irina Lukinskaya, was killed in Rostov's Aviators Park on the 6th of September. Arrest and release. On the 13th of September 1984, exactly 1 week after his 15th killing of the year, Chikatilo was observed by an undercover detective attempting to lure young women away from a Rostov bus station. He was arrested and held. A search of his belongings revealed a knife and rope. He was also discovered to be under investigation for minor theft at one of his former employers, which gave the investigators the legal right to hold him for a prolonged period of time. Chikatilo's dubious background was uncovered, and his physical description matched the description of the man seen with Dmitry Ptashnikov in March. These factors provided insufficient evidence to convict him of the murders, however. He was found guilty of the theft of the property from his previous employer and sentenced to 1 year in prison. He was freed on the 12th of December, 1984, after serving 3 months. On the 8th of October, 1984, the head of the Russian Public Prosecutor's Office formally linked 23 of Chikatilo's murders into one case and dropped all charges against the mentally handicapped youths who had previously confessed to the murders. Following the September 6 murder of Irina Lukinskaya, no further bodies were found bearing the trademark mutilation of Chikatilo's murders, and investigators in Rostov theorized that the unknown killer may have moved to another part of the Soviet Union and had continued killing there. The Rostov police sent bulletins to all forces throughout the Soviet Union, describing the network of wounds their unknown killer inflicted upon his victims and requesting feedback from any police force who had discovered murder victims with wounds matching those upon the victims found in the Rostov Oblast. The response was negative. No other police force had found murder victims with wounds matching those upon the description within the bulletin. Late murders and the manhunt. Upon his release from jail, Chikatilo found new work in Novotcherkassk and kept a low profile. He did not kill again until the 31st of July, 1985, when he murdered a young woman near Domodedovo Airport, near Moscow. 1 month later, Chikatilo killed another woman in Shakhty. Both victims were linked to the hunt for the killer. In November 1985, a special procurator named Isa Kostoyev was appointed to supervise the investigation. The known murders around Rostov were carefully reinvestigated, and police began another round of questioning of known sex offenders. The following month, the Militia and Voluntary People's Druzhina renewed the patrolling of railway stations around Rostov. The police also took the step of consulting a psychiatrist doctor, Alexander Bukhanovsky, the first such consultation in a serial killer investigation in the Soviet Union. Bukhanovsky produced a 65-page psychological profile of the unknown killer for the investigators, describing the killer as a man aged between 45 and 50 years old who was of average intelligence, was likely to be married or had previously been married, but who was also a sadist who could only achieve sexual arousal by seeing his victims suffer. Bukhanovsky also argued that because many of the killings had occurred on weekdays near mass transportation and across the entire Rostov Oblast, that the killer's work required him to travel regularly, and based upon the actual days of the week when the killings had occurred, the killer was most likely tied to a production schedule. Chikatilo followed the investigation carefully, reading newspaper reports about the manhunt for the killer and keeping his homicidal urges under control. Throughout 1986, he is not known to have committed any murders. In 1987, Chikatilo killed 3 times. On each occasion, he killed while on a business trip far away from the Rostov Oblast, and none of these murders were linked to the manhunt in Rostov. Chikatilo's first murder in 1987 was committed in May, when he killed a 13-year-old boy named Oleg Makarenkov in Revda. In July, he killed another boy in Zaporozhye and a third in Leningrad in September. In 1988, Chikatilo killed 3 times, murdering an unidentified woman in Krasny Sulin in April and 2 boys in May and July. His first killing bore wounds similar to those inflicted on the victims linked to the manhunt killed between 1982 and 1985. But as the woman had been killed with a slab of concrete, investigators were unsure whether to link the murder to the investigation. In May, Chikatilo killed a 9-year-old boy in Ilovaisk, Ukraine. The boy's wounds left no doubt the killer had struck again, and this murder was linked to the manhunt. On the 14th of July, Chikatilo killed a 15-year-old boy named Yevgeny Muratov at Donlaskos station near Shakhty. Muratov's murder was also linked to the investigation, although his body was not found until April 1989. Chikatilo did not kill again until the 8th of March, 1989, when he killed a 16-year-old girl in his daughter's vacant apartment. He dismembered her body and hid the remains in a sewer. As the victim had been dismembered, police did not link her murder to the investigation. Between May and August, Chikatilo killed a further 4 victims, 3 of whom were killed in Rostov and Shakhty, although only 2 of the victims were linked to the killer. On the 14th of January 1990, Chikatilo killed an 11-year-old boy in Shakhty. On the 7th of March, he killed a 10-year-old boy named Yaroslav Makarov in Rostov Botanical Gardens. The eviscerated body was found the following day. On the 11th of March, the leaders of the investigation, headed by Mikhail Fetisov, held a meeting to discuss progress made in the hunt for the killer. Fetisov was under intense pressure from the public, the press and the Ministry of the Interior in Moscow to solve the case. The intensity of the manhunt in the years up to 1984 had receded to a degree between 1985 and 1987, when Chikatilo had killed only 2 victims conclusively linked to the killer, both of them in 1985. By March 1990, 6 further victims had been linked to the killer. Fetisov had noted laxity in some areas of the investigation and warned people would be fired if the killer was not caught soon. Chikatilo had killed 3 further victims by August 1990. On the 4th of April, he killed a 31-year-old woman in Woodland near Donleskos Station. On the 28th of July, he lured a 13-year-old boy away from a Rostov train station and killed him in Rostov Botanical Gardens. And on the 14th of August, he killed an 11-year-old boy in the reeds near Novocherkassk Beach. The snare. The discovery of more victims sparked a massive operation by the police, as several victims had been found at stations on one rail route through the Rostov Oblast. Viktor Burakov, who had been involved in the hunt for the killer since 1982, suggested a plan to saturate all larger stations in the Rostov Oblast with an obvious uniformed police presence the killer could not fail to notice, with the intention to discourage the killer from attempting to strike at any of these locations, and with smaller and less busy stations patrolled by undercover agents, where his activities would be more likely to be noticed. The plan was approved, and both the uniformed and undercover officers were instructed to question any adult man in the company of a young woman or child and note their name and passport number. Police deployed 360 men at all the stations in the Rostov Oblast, and only undercover officers at the 3 smallest stations Kirpichnaya, Donleskos, and Lesostep on the route through the Oblast where the killer had struck most frequently, in an effort to force the killer to strike at one of these 3 stations. The operation was implemented on the 27th of October, 1990. On the 30th of October, police found the body of a 16-year-old boy named Vadim Gromov at Donleskos Station. Gromov had been killed on the 17th of October, 10 days prior to the implementation of the initiative. The same day Gromov's body was found, Chikatilo lured another 16-year-old boy, Viktor Tischenko, off a train at Kirpichnaya Station, another station under surveillance from undercover police, and killed him in a nearby forest. Surveillance. On the 6th of November 1990, Chikatilo killed and mutilated a 22-year-old woman named Sveta Korostik in Woodland near Donleskos Station. While leaving the crime scene, he was seen by an undercover officer. The policeman observed Chikatilo approach a well and wash his hands and face. When he approached the station, the undercover officer noted his coat had grass and soil stains at the elbows. Chikatilo also had a small red smear on his cheek. To the officer, he looked suspicious. The only reason people entered Woodland near the station at that time of year was to gather wild mushrooms, a popular pastime in Russia. Chikatilo, however, was not dressed like a typical forest hiker. He was wearing more formal attire. Moreover, he had a nylon sports bag which was not suitable for carrying mushrooms. The policeman stopped Chikatilo and checked his papers. Having no formal reason for arrest, Chikatilo was not held. When the policeman came back to his office, he filed a formal routine report indicating the name of the person he stopped at the train station. On the 13th of November, Korostik's body was found. Police summoned the officer in charge of surveillance at Donleskos Station and examined the reports of all men stopped and questioned in the previous week. Chikatilo's name was among those reports, and his name was familiar to several officers involved in the case, having been questioned in 1984 and placed on the 1987 suspect list. Upon checking with Chikatilo's present and previous employers, investigators were able to place Chikatilo in various towns and cities at times when several victims linked to the investigation had been killed. Former colleagues from Chikatilo's teaching days informed investigators Chikatilo had been forced to resign from his teaching position due to complaints of sexual assault from several pupils. Police placed Chikatilo under surveillance on the 14th of November. In several instances, particularly on trains or buses, he was observed to approach lone young women or children and engage them in conversation. If the woman or child broke off the conversation, Chikatilo would wait a few minutes, then seek another conversation partner. On the 20th of November, after 6 days of surveillance, Chikatilo left his house with a 1-gallon flask for beer, then wandered around Novokirksk, attempting to make contact with children he met on his way. Upon exiting a cafe, Chikatilo was arrested by 4 plainclothes police officers. Final arrest. Upon arrest, Chikatilo gave a statement claiming the suspicion against him was a mistake, and complained he had also been arrested in 1984 for the same series of murders. A strip search of the suspect revealed a further piece of evidence. One of Chikatilo's fingers had a flesh wound. Medical examiners concluded the wound was in fact from a human bite. Chikatilo's penultimate victim was a physically strong 16-year-old youth. At the crime scene, the police had found numerous signs of a ferocious physical struggle between the victim and his murderer. Although a finger bone was later found to be broken and his fingernail had been bitten off, Chikatilo had never sought medical attention for the wound. A search of Chikatilo's belongings revealed he had been in possession of a folding knife at the time of his arrest. Chikatilo was placed in a cell inside the KGB headquarters in Rostov with a police informer who was instructed to engage Chikatilo in conversation and elicit any information he could from him. The next day, the 21st of November, formal questioning of Chikatilo began. The interrogation of Chikatilo was performed by Isa Kostoyev. The strategy chosen by the police to elicit a confession was to lead Chikatilo to believe he was a very sick man in need of medical help. The intention of this strategy was to give Chikatilo hope that if he confessed, he would not be prosecuted by reason of insanity. Police knew their case against Chikatilo was largely circumstantial, and under Soviet law, they had 10 days in which they could legally hold a suspect before either charging or releasing him. Throughout the questioning, Chikatilo repeatedly denied he had committed the murders, although he did confess to molesting his pupils during his career as a teacher. He also produced several written essays for Kostoyev, which, although evasive regarding the actual murders, did reveal psychological symptoms consistent with those written by Dr. Bukhanovsky in 1985. The interrogation tactics used by Kostoyev may also have caused Chikatilo to become defensive. The informer, sharing a KGB cell with Chikatilo, reported to police that Chikatilo had informed him Kostoyev repeatedly asked him direct questions regarding the mutilations inflicted upon the victims. Chikatilo's confession. On the 29th of November, at the request of Burakov and Fedosov, Dr. Alexander Bukhanovsky, the psychiatrist who had written the 1985 psychological profile of the then unknown killer for the investigators, was invited to assist in the questioning of the suspect. Bukhanovsky read extracts from his 65-page psychological profile to Chikatilo. Within 2 hours, Chikatilo confessed to 36 murders police had linked to the killer, although he denied 2 additional murders the police had initially linked to him. On the 30th of November, he was formally charged with each of these 36 murders, all of which had been committed between June 1982 and November 1990. Chikatilo confessed to a further 20 killings which had not been connected to the case, either because the murders had been committed outside the Rostov Oblast, because the bodies had not been found, or, in the case of Yelena Zakatnova, because an innocent man had been convicted and executed for the murder. In December 1990, Chikatilo led police to the body of Alexei Kobatov, a boy he had confessed to killing in 1989 and whom he had buried in woodland near a Shakti cemetery, proving unequivocally he was the killer. He later led investigators to the bodies of 2 other victims he had confessed to killing. 3 of the 56 victims Chikatilo confessed to killing could not be found or identified, but Chikatilo was charged with killing 53 women and children between 1978 and 1990. He was held in the same cell in Rostov-on-Don where he had been detained on the 20th of November to await trial. Psychiatric evaluation. On the 20th of August, 1991, after completing the interrogation of Chikatilo and having completed a reenactment of all the murders at each crime scene, Chikatilo was transferred to the Serbsky Institute in Moscow for a 6-day psychiatric evaluation to determine whether he was mentally competent to stand trial. Chikatilo was analyzed by a senior psychiatrist, Dr. Andrei Chikatilo, who declared him legally sane on the 18th of October. In December 1991, details of Chikatilo's arrest and a brief summary of his crimes was released to the newly liberated media by police. Trial and execution. The trial of Andrei Chikatilo was the first major event of post-Soviet Russia. Chikatilo stood trial in Rostov on the 14th of April 1992. During the trial, he was kept in an iron cage in a corner of the courtroom to protect him from attack by the many hysterical and enraged relatives of his victims. Chikatilo's head had been shaven, a standard prison precaution against lice. Relatives of victims regularly shouted threats and insults to Chikatilo throughout the trial, demanding that authorities release him so that they could kill him themselves. Each murder was discussed individually, and on several occasions, relatives broke down in tears when details of their relative's murder were revealed. Some even fainted. Chikatilo regularly interrupted the trial, exposing himself, singing, and refusing to answer questions put to him by the judge. He was regularly removed from the courtroom for interrupting the proceedings. On May 13, Chikatilo withdrew his confessions to 6 of the killings to which he had previously confessed. In July 1992, Chikatilo demanded that the judge be replaced for making too many rash remarks about his guilt. His defense counsel backed the claim. The judge looked to the prosecutor, and even the prosecutor backed the defense's judgment, stating the judge had indeed made too many such remarks. The judge ruled the prosecutor be replaced instead. On the 9th of August, both prosecution and defense delivered their final arguments before the judge. Chikatilo again attempted to interrupt the proceedings and had to be removed from the courtroom. Final sentence was postponed until the 14th of October. As the final deliberations began, the brother of Lyudmila Alexieva, a 17-year-old girl killed by Chikatilo in August 1984, threw a heavy chunk of metal at Chikatilo, hitting him in the chest. When security tried to arrest the young man, other victims' relatives shielded him, preventing him from being arrested. On the 14th of October, the court reconvened, and the judge read the list of murders again, not finishing until the following day. On the 15th of October, Chikatilo was found guilty of 52 of the 53 murders and sentenced to death for each offense. Chikatilo kicked his bench across his cage when he heard the verdict and began shouting abuse. He was offered a final chance to make a speech in response to the verdict, but remained silent. Upon passing final sentence, Judge Leonid Akobzianov made the following speech. Taking into consideration the monstrous crimes he committed, this court has no alternative but to impose the only sentence that he deserves. I therefore sentence him to death. On the 4th of January 1994, Russian President Boris Yeltsin refused a last-ditch appeal for clemency. On the 14th of February, Chikatilo was taken to a soundproofed room in Novocherkassk prison and executed by a single gunshot behind the right ear.